I was living my life in the servitude of misunderstandings of people I love. Giving it all, it was never enough. Because of the fall, I could never get up. I moved on from their misunderstandings. I am no longer standing under them. I was drowning, now I swim. 'Cause I found the strength within. I don't need your absent friend. 'Cause I got this. 'Cause I got this, yeah. 'Cause I got this, yeah. 'Cause I got this, yeah. This is holy ground. Depraved and deprived, I was living your life, lost in a moment with true sacrifice. Voices of plenty that never seem right, visions, distractions that alter my sight. I moved on from their misunderstandings. I am no longer standing under them. I was drowning, now I swim. 'Cause I found the strength within. I don't need your absence, friend. 'Cause I got this, yeah. 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 This is holy ground.
Welcome in, everybody, on this beautiful Tuesday night. I almost said Wednesday. Y'all know I be mixing my days up. I'm so glad that y'all are here with us this evening. And of course, as you're coming in, let us know where you're watching from. You could be watching with your neighbor. As you're coming in, let us know. Super excited for tonight's conversation. Oh my goodness. So a few weeks ago, Bob Swanson, who's already in the chat. What's going on, Bob? He's working with us with Bridge City. He helps on the production team. He's leading the Children's and Families Initiative for us, and just an all-around great guy. And he sent me a random text message, and he said, "Hey, I'm ruining the surprise, but I just want to let you know that I'm sending you a book." And the book he sent me, let me grab it, almost tripped. I don't know how I almost tripped while sitting down, but it happens. But he sent me this book, Whispers in the Pews. And I started reading this book, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, this is like really, really good." Y'all know I'm a sociology geek, and so I was like, "Oh, this is research. Oh my goodness, this is so fun." And so I've read through the book, and Bob showed me some videos of the author, and I said, "You know what? I want to invite her on the channel." And so tonight I'm going to be joined by sociologist Dr. Amy McDowell. She's the author of Whispers in the Pews. Now, this book examines evangelical church culture, not just through what churches preach publicly, but through what people learn to say, not say, avoid, soften, and even whisper. For many people who have left evangelical spaces, the issue was not only doctrine, it was the culture of silence around race, gender, sexuality, politics, doubt, empathy, and power. And for many of you that have been following me for any amount of time, if you've heard my story, a lot of these things were at the intersection of my own deconstruction and deconversion journey, having to wrestle with why we're silent about affirming homosexuals in our church while affirming all other types of people in our church. It was very troubling for me. So today we're going to talk about how evangelical communities create belonging, how they police belonging, and what happens when unity becomes a performance of sameness. Amy is an associate professor and associate chair of sociology, as well as the director of Queer Mississippi Histories, the Queer Mississippi Histories Project, which I think that could be a whole nother conversation. I want more information on that. And working in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of the University of Mississippi. I am super duper glad to have her on tonight. I'm going to be super focused, y'all, on the interview tonight. I'm going to try my best to keep up with chat as much as I can, but I am going to be super focused on the interview aspect. And so if you have a question for me or Dr. Amy, please super chat, because super chat allows the question to be stored in a special category. And when I get a break, I can find it. You don't have to super chat $100. I would not be mad at it if you did. You can super chat whatever amount gets you in there, and we'll be good to go. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Dr. Amy on the stage, and I hope y'all are ready for this conversation. Welcome in.
Hi. And there I am,
goodness.
popped on the screen.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Like, I'm going to be like a little kid in the candy store throughout this whole conversation, so please bear with me. I guess before we get into the interview segment, would you mind sharing with us a little bit about who you are and why you got into the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. Sometimes I think sociologists have these questions about how did you end up being that, whenever most of us don't even know what it is until we take a college class. So I could tell you that college journey, but I think that I moved a couple times as a child, and one time was in the middle of the school year, my first time moving out of Mississippi. And so there was just something about being the new kid in a different place that I had to really pay attention to what was going on around me. And maybe I didn't have to, but I did. And that stuck with me, just that kind of deep observation. I think I was like training to be an ethnographer from a fairly young age. And then I moved again in like kind of high school years. So another kind of time where it's like probably not your chosen time to be moving, relocating, and hoping to join a new circle of friends. But along the way, I was also, as a child growing up in Mississippi, like most Mississippians or Southerners in the U.S., I was immersed in Christian culture and evangelical culture more specifically, although that's an umbrella term that we can talk more about in a little bit. But my parents went to a charismatic congregation that had kind of Pentecostal influences. My grandmother and the church that my mom was baptized in is a traditional white Southern Baptist church in a very rural area. There's not even a gas station within 10 miles. I was baptized in that church. So church was part of my life. And then it just kind of fell out of my life, or I drifted away from it and I think my parents may have gotten kind of tired of church shopping with the different moves, became frustrated with their own, like trying to find the right place. And then I wasn't asking to keep going back. And I got involved in music culture pretty heavily when I lived in Pensacola, Florida. And I also started to make friends with people who were having more kind of questionable thoughts about society and about power relationships and about social hierarchies. And around that time, I happened to take a sociology class, and I was like, oh, this helps me develop a language and understanding in a systematic way that like punk rock music or something was doing, but not doing in that systematic methodological way. And that was very helpful for me. And then I finished my undergrad studies in Colorado Springs, which I wanted to get out of the South really bad. And I ended up in a city that kind of unbeknownst to me is very dominated by conservative religious right politics. At the time. I think things are changing in Colorado and have changed since I lived there, but Focus on the Family is headquartered in Colorado Springs. I lived there during the George W. Bush administration. So all of those things, as I was a sociology major, minoring in women's and ethnic studies, I became interested in religion, but from another way. I hadn't really put a lot of thought of it in a while since I had drifted away from it myself. But I became fascinated in kind of family values, culture wars, and how that Christian conservatives were taking sides with the Republican Party to enact their war in Iraq. And so I think it was all of those things that rekindled my interest, kindled my sociological interest in religion. And then I ended up doing a dissertation on how Christian and Muslim youth express their religious identity or identification in punk rock subcultures. So I was trying to like merge two of my worlds together. And then, yeah. And, you know, there's always the journey of like graduate school and all of that I could get into, but that's kind of the more personal narrative of how sociology became part of my life and my understanding, and why I ended up studying religion. And I seemed like I can't seem to move away from it. Like it's always the thing that keeps drawing me back.
Wow. That there was a few interesting things you said there. I love the aspect of saying punk rock was giving you some things, but or giving you some introduction into some of these social hierarchies, but sociology kind of gave you a language and a systematic way of approaching it. And then also just that this struggle with religion begins shaping around these family culture, about family value culture wars. And just quick thought, and we'll jump in this interview. I remember when September 11th happened, and I remember a lot of the rhetoric around it because I was still a young minister. I was a Christian campus club president in high school at the time. And I just remember the rhetoric of "we will never forget." And, you know, like, we will never forget, and we're going to go get war, and we're going to do stuff like this. And as a African-American Christian, that rhetoric struck me as unchristian, because that was not how African-Americans were told that they could feel. We were not told that we could say things like, we will never forget, and that we can go get vengeance, and that we should be. It's like, no, you got to get over that stuff. Why are we still talking about these things? And so I remember that serving as a very interesting splinter in the foundation of what I felt that was going on. And that continued probably on until 2004, because I was going to a church very similar to the church that you're studying in Whispers in the Pews. It wasn't a Southern Baptist church, but it was a charismatic church with highly conservative values that I had never really recognized until the 2004, I think it was 2004. Yeah, I was graduating, 2004 election. And having to sit in there realizing, and I remember having this thought as a young minister at the time. At that time, I was a youth pastor. Like, whoa, we seem to be kind of anti-democracy. We seem to have more theocratic values. And I was like, I just remember that making me feel very uncomfortable with myself, because I didn't know which side I was supposed to lean on. If I am a part of this faith and this faith tradition, and I do accept these things as true, then our approach to scripture does lead us to this type of conclusion that God above all. But then I realized that conflicted with democratic values. And at that time, I really didn't know what to do with that. I did not know what to do with that conflict. So it's very encouraging that other people are getting involved, because I stayed in church for a lot longer. I got into sociology on accident. I initially went to college to be a secondary educator, and very quickly realized that, oh no, I don't want to do that. I'm not interested anymore. And then I had to find something to major in. And I started reading up a little bit about the social sciences, and I said, well, I'll take a few classes. And I was hooked after that. Started learning about redlining. And I was like, oh, there's language here. Okay, I get to learn some things. Okay, so enough about me. I'm not going to tell my whole story tonight. So let's jump into our interview. For people who have not read Whispers in the Pews yet, what is this book about, and what question were you trying to answer as a sociologist?
Yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate hearing more about you and your journey to sociology. It's fascinating, and sometimes it's by happenstance.
Yes.
Yeah. So the book, what is the book about? So in brief, and we'll get into this a little bit more, I'm sure, but I did an ethnography of a church between 2016 and 2019. And I really went there with this really basic question: what are people talking about at church? Things are kind of exploding socially, politically. There's a lot of news headlines about the evangelical support for the presumptive nominee, Donald Trump, at the time when I started this study. There was also a religious liberty bill passed in Mississippi that was specifically protecting the right of an individual, organization, or institution to deny services as far-reaching as possible to anyone if they are lesbian, gay, transgender. And so that context really made me wonder, like, how are people talking about this at church? How are they talking about religious freedom? To what extent are they talking about it? How are they talking about a controversial person like Trump, but not only Trump and not only religious freedom, but really as those are kind of like the things that all of us can kind of grab onto immediately and say, yes, those are conflicting or controversial topics and they're polarizing.
Yes.
And so amid that polarization, what are churches doing? And I was really interested in the church that I call Welcome in the book, because they were promoting this identification of, we are a welcoming congregation. We want to do what other churches aren't doing in town. We want to be really a safe space for mixed racial families, for people who feel like that they don't belong in the traditional religious spaces. We want to be a multi-ethnic church, oftentimes using the language of multi-ethnic or multiracial. And the pastor of that church was very friendly and open to the idea of me studying the church, which I all felt was very brave. I don't know that a lot of churches that are new and up and coming would allow for a sociologist. And especially now, I mean, I think even 10 years ago, that might be easier, but now I think it's even harder, because sociology in itself has been kind of attacked by some governors in some states and been taken off of college curriculum. Wow. So I really appreciate the church for that. I think that they did in some ways want to learn about themselves and their welcoming mission through, as they would say, an outsider's eyes. And that's certainly the case. But my relationship with Mississippi and everything helps me establish some rapport there. But this book, when I'm talking about what are people talking about at church, my big kind of takeaway point is that there's a lot of management being carried out, conversation management in everyday interactions. Yeah. And so I spent a lot of times with small groups, actually 8 different small groups. So I really wanted to see not just what pastors were saying or leaders, but what people that go to church and see it as an important part of their lives. What are they talking about? How do they handle sticky subjects, whether those be theological, social, personal? And I just, I found myself writing a lot of times where that you think that the conversation's about to go somewhere and then it disappears. And and I started to notice after a while that this code that I had created called small talk just started to grow and grow and grow. And I noticed that fairly early on, and I just started paying more attention to it. And I started to write my field notes much more vigorously so that I could really cross-check myself that this wasn't just my imagination. So I'm showing in the book how that people avoid silence, how people avoid subjects that they find political or potentially divisive. And of course, we can all define what's political and divisive in different ways. But I would say that's kind of the short answer, is what kind of work small talk and silence and omission does for the perseverance of conservative politics, even as we see that go more and more extreme to the right.
Yeah. See, okay. So I like that, because I love the fact that you said it wasn't just important to see what the leaders are saying, but to actually see what the people who are coming there every day. What do you think people misunderstand about how churches shape political and moral imagination?
Can you ask me that one more time?
Sure. Like, what do you think people misunderstand about how churches shape political and moral imagination? And to provide a little context and color there, many people in the secular community who are not familiar with church dynamics often assume that what's happening in these churches is the pastor is telling everybody, this is who to vote for, this is how you vote, these are what our values are. And from your work, how did you see political imagination being shaped? Was that something being shaped from the top down?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't had anyone ask me that question yet. And so that's really fascinating. And it makes sense as a former pastor that you'd be like, hey, what do you think is going on there?
Yes.
So, yeah, I think that's just the thing, is that in some ways, yes, the pastor and people look up to pastors, and they certainly looked up to this pastor, and he has influence. And pastors have influence, and I'm sure you had influence.
Yes.
But the people that are in those churches have a lot of influence too. And they're shaping in these subtle ways that sometimes they might not be fully aware of, what is permissible.
Mm-hmm.
And when those things aren't even spoken, you mentioned at the top of the show about LGBTQ plus inclusion. These are one of the things that I never heard the pastor say in any explicit way, although he did talk about heterosexual marriages being really important and men's and women's roles in those marriages. But at the same time, did stay carefully away from the subject of what happens if a gay couple comes to this church.
Yes.
And we're a welcoming church. So we're really putting that front and center. But the fact that I found out in interviews that people did have different opinions about that, but they had all come to this unspoken conclusion and rule that they all abided by to not bring it up to one another. And I find that fascinating how that culture of communication, like these conversational norms, really shape where churches, like political positions, where they can land, what people might implicitly agree with, even though if you ask them personally, do they agree with it? Maybe not so much, but at a collective level, it becomes somewhat of an assumed position that no, the church probably wouldn't be so okay with that. Maybe someone could come that's gay, but whether or not they become a member, I don't know. Do I really want to bring it up to anyone? No. That to me is really powerful, because that could also be shaping how the pastor approaches it, which is, I'm just not going to talk about it either. Like, as long as we all agree to keep that to look away from that elephant in the room, we're okay. Like, we can be unified. And that's really important. And I think it's something that is not always excavated in our text about religious culture, and particularly evangelical culture. There's a lot in books about what, and introductions of people tended to not talk about these things that were hot button issues. But how do we understand that process?
Yeah, that is so good. Thank you for sharing that. It just, I have so many thoughts running through my mind right now, just like at a mile a minute, because then I immediately start thinking about social cues and how it seems that a lot of church members are participating in that, from the leadership to the members themselves, participating in kind of picking up on the social cues, which is kind of the environment that we've created by not talking, by not having the conversations, by talking around them, or engaging in small talk. We've created a climate, or an environment rather, where we learn what to say and not to say by social cues. And so if someone seems they're getting a little uncomfortable, we're going to switch the topic. And I even know me as a pastor, and even just as a public communicator, I do that when I'm speaking live. I still do that when I'm speaking live. If I'm giving a presentation and the audience doesn't seem to like one thing that I'm saying, I'm going to pivot so quick away from that if it's not necessary to the text, but not necessary to the presentation. But definitely in the church world, even as a pastor, when it came down to what we support, I was never a anti-LGBTQ plus person, but I never preached not one pro LGBTQ message, not nowhere near it. And it wasn't because anyone had told me, Pastor, you can't do that. But I could tell just with the discomfort of the conversations that this was problematic. And one of the stories that I've shared with our community is that I actually put this in one of my books, is we hired someone to do music for us one time who was what I called apparently gay, which means this person had not outed themselves or anything. They didn't go by gay. They just looked gay to most people. And we hired them to be our music leader, and lost nearly 40% of our congregation, within 2 or 3 weeks. It was drastic. And I did get to talk to a few members about it, what's going on. And the overwhelming feedback was incredibly homophobic, and it was terrifying to me. But at that time, we decided to keep that person. We did eventually part ways, but then we hired another person who was actually out, and our church actually grew a little bit after that. But it was just shocking to me to see that the more that we stayed away from the conversation, the more that it kind of allowed things to exist in that climate that never got addressed. And I was contributing to it, and that's, I hate to just be honest with it, out of fear for my safety. I didn't want to be called names and drugged through the mud and be the person that's, oh no, you're doing the wrong thing against God. Because in that culture, that's a heavy accusation. It's not just you're upholding some social value. It's not just you're trying to protect the dignity of of other humans. It's not that you're trying to uphold humanity. It's you're going against God, and that's such a scary place for a pastor to live in.
Yeah.
So, yeah. If you have anything, I'll shut up.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the studies that I looked into while I was doing this research, and I think I refer to it in the chapter, "We don't build walls, we build longer tables." Or no, the America isn't divided, but the church cannot be. Is I talk about the ways in which the pastor was pretty ambiguous in his language, even whenever it was like something that everyone clearly knew about because it was something that happened like right in their own town, which is one of the reasons I named the town, just because I thought kind of being able to reference the events was a way for me to talk about what was being avoided. Like if I'm not able to give a context to what's being able to be avoided, who am I to say what people were being silent about? Right? Like it's a hard thing to study, silence and avoidance. Like to show that, like how do you show that sociologically? So anyway, I talk about the ways in which he's ambiguous in that chapter, or modeled that ambiguity, and so did churchgoers. So, for instance, they had this kind of I would have called it a slogan: "We don't build walls, we build longer tables." And that was like part of the welcoming mission. And I many times thought that was referring. Is that a jab at Trump? Is that a jab at the immigration policies of this proposed wall along the U.S.-Mexico border? And so I never heard that said explicitly. And when I would ask people in interviews, I found out that a lot of times they wouldn't refer to that at all. They seemed to not even think about that.
Wow.
But I felt like with the pastor, that was different in my side conversations, that for him, it did have there was some resonance between that and that message. But again, he's not going to say that explicitly. Right. And I think that there have been some studies that have suggested that pastors now can feel like if they say something that just pokes the bear of kind of the conspiracy theorist or the more right-wing, outspoken factions of their church, that they're going to be harassed, that they're going to face all kind of repercussions. And I bet that, what you're talking about is just like being excluded, or not even being excluded, but really kind of being put over the fire. And I don't know if I want that. And I think that right now in this moment that we're in, that's coupled with this extreme polarization and anger that's really fueled by a radical right, that along with that, we're in a place where that people can comment on social media, on YouTube, etc. And that makes everyone feel a little bit more wary about what they say from that pulpit and from that stage. So I can understand the hesitation and the inclination to be ambiguous at times when one is in those kind of leadership roles.
Oh my. Well, and that brings me to our next question. One of the central ideas in your book is small talk. Now, most people think of small talk as harmless conversation. How are you using this term differently in this book? Like, what is small talk to you in the context of this study?
Yeah, so as you said, it's like small talk is this commonly called a way for us to get to know one another, maybe get a better job, meet so-and-so, form a relationship, right? Like there's many articles all the time that come out about why small talk is good for you, and why small talk can help our social relationships, and why small talk can help us be a less divided society. And I certainly indulge in small talk. I'm a Southerner. Like I know how to do it. How would I even do this study if I couldn't do it? Like as one of my friends said, like you're white and you're from the South. Like it's like the thing of this part of the practice.
Yes.
But what I want to point out is that small talk can be taken too far. And it's also a way for us to exercise omission. So it is a putative process of omission that prescribes what cannot be said and what cannot be talked about. So in many ways, it's like the way in which we're taking the boundaries and we're defining what is appropriate and what's inappropriate, what's acceptable, what's taboo, what's going too far. And so small talk is really a concept I'm using and building out to talk about the ways in which, or identify the ways in which we learn in our social interactions who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to. And I think in that way, it can limit what's possible to think about. I guess that's really the main takeaway for me from writing this book, is that it wasn't just that people are sticking to what they might call, what some of them called surface talk, or staying away from subjects that might be too complicated or too difficult or challenging or potentially disruptive. But because of that, going away from those difficult and hard conversations, there's also limits on what's possible to contemplate. And it's limits how much people can get to know one another, right? Like there's something also very personal about this, that people can't share a lot of their lives because our lives are complicated.
Yeah.
Even for everybody that's going to church 3 times a week, like there's something going on that they don't want people to talk about at church.
Absolutely.
Right. And so and because of that, there's like, I was almost like you're chopping down the bridge to empathy. It's like it becomes more impossible to build those kind of empathetic understandings of what other people are going through that, of course, help us shift our perspective and can be transformative for us as well. So I really think about small talk as not only limiting what is possible to talk about, but also what's possible to think about and contemplate.
That's good. I remember when I was going through my divorce, because I was going through a divorce at the same time that I was going through my crisis of faith, if you will. And I was seeking counseling from my pastoral mentor at the time. And I'd been in counseling sessions with him plenty of times before, but it was something about those latter years where I just started kind of paying attention more and realizing that we weren't really having a conversation. He wasn't really interrogating, where I was, what I was thinking, what I was responding to or reacting to. It was more like there's already a fixed guideline of things that are appropriate to say in this situation, and those are the things that I'm going to say. And that was kind of my first realization that, I'm not actually getting real counseling here. I'm not getting real help here. I'm just kind of being handed a script. And so what I found interesting while reading through the book is that in some of these conversations, the small talk, like obviously it's second nature for me to see this as a way to keep political polarization down. We're not going to talk politics. One that kind of shocked me a little bit, though, after reading it, I'm like, I've definitely seen this before, was one of the stories you told, and I cannot remember the pseudonyms, but it was at one of the small groups with the women who were talking about motherhood and talking about their husbands. And one tried to just, unpack a little bit that she's a little frustrated at home and she wished things could be a little better. And how quickly the conversation shifted away from that. Like, those feelings are not okay to express. This is not okay to have. What was most shocking to you? And I know I didn't write this one down, but what was most shocking to you? What was your most shocking discovery about small talk? Because me going in, I'd be like, okay, this is going to be no sex, no politics, nothing dealing, with anything super duper taboo. Was there anything you were surprised about? Like, we can't talk about this here either?
Yeah, what you just described, that is in the chapter Back to Basics, which is really centers on the church's teachings about gender, and that it was much more, let's say, in your face about that than it was about everything else, which I also found fascinating, and really stressed that men and women have different responsibilities in their marriages, and that men needed to take more ownership of decision making and be more responsible in decision making, and not let women make those decisions or make decisions, without also checking in with them. So it was, what I describe in that text is how that it becomes a more emphasized or exaggerated form of gender complementarianism. And what I found surprising, like as you just pointed to, there's a section of that chapter that I titled "Don't Complain," and it's about women in a book club that I attended. And this book club met every couple months, so it wasn't even monthly, but it was usually more or less the same few women, and it would be less, maybe anywhere between 5 and 8 women maybe tops. So it was a good place to like get to know people in the church and get to know people in a more intimate way. And there were several books that we read that sometimes they would be about a marriage, but not exactly. Like the marriage would be part of the story, but not the center of the story. And we were reading this book called Falling Free by evangelical superstar. And she's talking about, moving out of the church in a traditional space and going and ministering to impoverished communities. It's got kind of this missionary work. You've got to go out to the racially and marginalized and the poor communities and move into those communities and make church there. Like that's what God wants us to do. And then sometimes she'd mention her husband, but not a lot. But it's interesting that in the context of that discussion, what kept coming up by a few women was their husbands. Like they wanted to talk about their husbands and how they weren't so happy with them, and how that, they wish that they could do something like this author was doing, but their husband would never be on board with it. And again, kind of going back without them saying it explicitly, it's like, I can't do that if my husband's not on board because he's making the call, right?
Yeah.
And there were a few times where that it was like, oh God, I remember this one time that one of the women that I can't remember the pseudonym off the top of my head, so I won't say. But she says, if he's not happy, like no one's happy. And she kind of rolled her eyes and just total frustration. And you could tell like she was really feeling it. And she was trying to find a place to express that. And it was just completely like moved on. Someone brought up something else about the book. There were moments where there was kind of a assuring head nods or like, yes, I'm having the same experience. But it was interesting to me how that I thought that maybe just like anywhere, like women getting together that are straight sometimes like to talk bad about their husbands as a way to bond. But that in this context, it seemed like even that was off limits and that was potentially going to be a problem. So there wasn't space allowed for that. And, there's times in which that could be very scary because someone could be in a scary situation and maybe not feel like that they can bring that up in their church community. So I was a little stunned by that, how quickly the conversation would change when the subject of husbands come up. Another example would be in the chapter America is Divided, but the Church Cannot Be. I talk about when I ask the leader of the racial reconciliation group, have they ever talked about Trump, because the group was set up after his election in 2016. Right. So I was curious, like, given that was some of the impetus behind one of the person that started it to start it, because she wanted to create like a space of healing. And she looked at me from the side of her eyes. I still remember it, like visually. She's like, oh, we don't talk about that. Wow. and I just got from the expression and everything, like, okay, I learned to not even bring it up right now because we were at the group and it was like over the potatoes that I asked her, potato chips. And I thought, okay, I don't want to cause any problems. I'll ask you later in a private interview, which I did. But also there was a conflict to take the Mississippi at the time had the Confederate battle flag in its state flag. And there were movements to take it down off of the University of Mississippi campus. There were student-led movements to take the Confederate statue off the enter. It was like this gigantic statue of a Confederate soldier that like one of the first things you could see whenever you would come enter the university's main entrance. And so all that is going on, right? Like it's not just at the national level, at the local level, there's a lot happening. Yeah. And that in this racial reconciliation group, that there was space for people to talk about, particularly Black members, to talk about their personal experiences of racism that they had endured, or their experiences of racism at their workplace. But those kinds of things that were going on in the wider community were not brought up.
Wow. And that's I want to say it's alarming, but for me, it was a reminder. I haven't been a part of the church world in a decade now. But like literally reading through this book kind of took me back to a lot of places. The last major church organization that I worked for was the Alabama Southern Baptist Convention. I worked for Calhoun County, and whoa, what an experience that was. But this concept of small talk is absolutely fascinating to me, and the way that it really kind of controls the conversation. But not only how it controls the conversation, how it forces people to change their behavior. And I think that the reason why that particular example struck me so much, and you kind of hinted at it, it was like, ooh, what if something really bad was going on at home that she really needed to get off? Like, what if this was a moment of her needing, or any of them needing safety? What if this was a moment? And then I guess, and maybe this is just from my old pastoral mind, I'm like, we're supposed to be creating these environments for people to come in and be safe and be able to connect with others. But then at the same time, we're creating these social mechanisms that actually prevent people from actually being able to be honest about themselves. It somewhat reminded me of what commonly gets called toxic positivity, where, you know, we're only going to talk about the positive things. We're only going to talk about the good things. And so none of the bad things ever get addressed. Now, in your opinion, is small talk always a problem, or does it only become a problem when it replaces honesty?
Yeah, and what would happen if we're all honest all the time? I don't know if we can handle it. But, yeah, I think that the small talk, again, it can be taken to, it can take off like a life of its own, where that it becomes such a go-to that it gets in the way of conversations that need to be had. Yeah. And so, for instance, if the church is doing its multiracial mission, to rather than say that it's doing it and it wants to do it, is say, well, how is it doing? What are we doing? Why do we care? What is our goal? Do we have a goal? Are there certain goals? What do we mean by multiracial? What do we mean by diverse? Yeah. What do those terms mean for us? So small talk is sometimes about that. It's not allowing for us to be clear about what we're even saying, right? To talk through that. Yeah. And of course, when we're in sociology or in the social sciences, you have to define your terms. So I need to be fair to people. Like, I'm trained to have to define the terms. And even that is hard. Like, if you told me to define religion right now, I'd go, woo, that's hard, right? Like, because it's so complicated and complex. So saying that is not to down people or say that's easy. Yeah. It's not easy. But if there's not space allowed for it, it really makes where that you're saying you're doing something, but maybe nothing's actually happening, and you're not really working. You're not really going anywhere. It just sounds like what I call welcome talk. Yep. Rather than actually being welcoming, or actually being a multiracial, inclusive community. So, but I've seen this in other spaces, right? Is that it's not just church spaces where that we might be inclined to emphasize the things that we have in common. And that could be as simple as, hey, that's a really great outfit you have on. My students brought this up when we talked about my book. I didn't make them read it, but I told them the premise because it was coming out when I was teaching sociology of religion this past semester. And I had a student say, yeah, when I'm at the sorority houses, I said, you strike me as a student who is really always yourself, like a person who's always yourself. You told me you live in a sorority. Me and another student commented on this. Do you manage what you say? I couldn't help but kind of pick on her, but like, how do you do this? Like, how do you navigate your everyday life at the sorority house? But she just said, well, we just talk about the TikTok video we just saw, or we'll make comments on someone's outfit, or we'll be like, oh yeah, did you see that? Or did you eat that? Or did you have the smoothie? That becomes the substance and the subject of the conversation, because she said, things are just so polarizing now. I just feel like if I say anything, it's going to make somebody mad. And, I just want to get along with people when I'm there. So I don't think it's something that's just unique to churches. I think there is something that we could say might be more elaborated in church spaces like the one I studied. Absolutely. I think I 100% agree with that. Because I've been calling it just this march towards sameness. So even within the secular community, in some of our political discussions and some of our discussions about what's right, what's wrong, I realize we can sometimes go to such hard extremes that it becomes a
performance of sameness. There's no room for nuance. There's no room for discussion. There's no room for disagreement. And so in a place where there is no room for disagreement, it's very tempting to get in that place to just say, okay, we'll just perform sameness. We'll just go along. Yeah, that's how we used to say it back in the day, go along to get along type of thing. One of the things that I'm interested in, and this is going to be a little bit of a pivot from the conversation, but you mentioned that Welcome, it was really important for them to be multiracial and multi-ethnic. What I am curious of is, did the leadership formation of the church, did it represent multiracial, like a multiracial mix-up? Were there people of color in leadership at Welcome?
There was a person of color in leadership at Welcome, and
Okay.
he's featured in the book, and he's going to be kind of seen if anyone figures out what church it is, just because and I thought about that. It's like, oh, and sometimes I do this thing where for some of the people that were very active in the church who are Black or Latino, is I might shift the names with one from like an interview quote to the participant observation for them, just because I needed to make it a little bit harder to figure out who's who. Yeah. Especially for people that living in this town and might try to figure that out. But so with that said, obviously that means very much in the minority.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I asked that question because that was something I struggled with back when I was a pastor. Is number one, there were very few churches that actually were multiracial, especially at that time, or multi-ethnic. There were some, but not a lot. And the vast majority of the ones that were still primarily white led from the platform. It's still primarily white leadership, and you might have one or two people doing something, and typically their roles were much lower than everybody else's. And I kind of wondered why that was. But then there was another interesting phenomenon that was just mind-blowing to me, is that almost all of the churches that were multiracial were led by white pastors. Black pastors, as hard as they would try to be multiracial, they'd adopt the more, I can't remember what the style of music was called back then, but the more praise and worship style, CCM style of music, switching over to like the bands and incorporating that, but it wouldn't always generate that same level of success. And then there was one pastor, and to his credit, out of Greenville, South Carolina, he was a mega church pastor that, kind of like the pastor in Welcome, being a multiracial church really meant something to him. It was very important to him. And he did very early on successfully build a church that it had Blacks, it had Latinos, it had Asian folk, white folk. I remember the first time I went, I was overwhelmed. I was just like, oh, this is so amazing, because I'd never seen anything like that, especially in the South. And so I had to ask him, how does this happen? And he said, well, for years we led this and we did pretty good. But at some point I had to get intentional. And so he said he started actually identifying people in the community who was doing work that could benefit the church, and partnering with them more directly. And so their staff was fully multi-ethnic, and that gave their church a great culture from an outside looking in at the time. But I've always been fascinated by the racial makeup of churches. I hired an associate pastor once who was a white man, and he was actually like one of my best friends. Mm-hmm. And after being an associate pastor at the church for a while, he flat out told me, not in an offensive way, even though it will come off as offensive to other people, but he told me in a very direct manner. He was sad to say it. He was like, I don't think I could be a member of a Black church. And he couldn't explain or describe the discomfort, but it was very uncomfortable for him, being a part of a church that was majority another culture. And so I've always been fascinated by that, and just by the amount of churches who really struggle with that, because that's still a struggle. Okay, I don't want to lock us in there, but
no. Well, it's funny that you ended on comfort, because when you first started talking about this, I wrote a note to myself. I just wrote comfort.
Wow.
like being white-led multiracial churches is like the comfort in defining what are the terms, like what are the limits, like how multiracial are we going to be?
That's right.
What does that mean? Right, because there's a lot of this about the small talk or avoidance is also about white people staying comfortable.
Yes. And then that's very interesting. I was listening to a conversation today from a friend who was doing a live earlier, and he was kind of venting about some of his frustrations with being a part of the community he's a part of. And his wording was sort of like, I shouldn't have to perform whiteness, he's like, I can talk like you all, I can look like you all, but I shouldn't have to be accepted. I shouldn't have to. I should still be able to be me. And honestly, that's something I struggle with every room I'm in. Is this a room that I have to perform in, or is this a room that I can just be me? A common critique, or I don't want to call it a critique, but a common thing that people say to me, "Oh, Darante, you just sound like a preacher." And I'm like, I know that's such an easy word to pull on, but under that, I hear you sound black. You just sound a little too black for me. Because when I hear my voice, I hear James Earl Jones, who wasn't a preacher. I hear Samuel L. Jackson, who's the furthest thing from a preacher. And yet it's the same type of cadence, same type of texture.
Yeah.
And so what I hear is the way you talk makes me uncomfortable because it's not culturally what I'm used to. And that's just the nuance that we sit in sometimes. Oh my. So let me ask you this, as a sociologist, how do you understand religion? And not just whether religious claims are true or false. I would not hold your feet to the fire on that. But what religion is doing socially, emotionally, politically, and institutionally in people's lives. And did this study help sharpen or shape what you may feel religion is doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. In sociology of religion class, we spend a semester thinking through those kinds of questions. But one of the things that I think I use kind of primarily two frames for thinking about religion and studying religion. And that is a more cultural frame. Like, what do people do together? How do they make things together, resources together? How do they understand and come to a shared understanding together through the things like the rituals or the ceremonies or the small talk, the conversations? Like, if we think of that as a ritual. So how are they setting the boundaries of who's in and who's out? And I think that is the way that I look at it in this kind of more interactionist and cultural term, maybe more so than organizational or institutional lens, but that is certainly a very relevant and important area of a way of understanding religion. Religion clearly can be a source of comfort for people, a sense of meaning to lives that feel in disarray or feel unpredictable and chaotic. It creates order. As someone, I know that you are a fan of Emil Durkheim. We know that, right? Religion, that's where I always start my sociology of religion class, because it is very helpful for understanding how the people come to shared attitudes. And I think that question alone is very fascinating to me. How do people get these common sentiments? And you can look at that with punk rock culture or hip hop culture or church culture, but that is kind of the open definition that someone like Durkheim provides for us is thinking about shared sentiments and order, the order that comes out of those shared sentiments. So I think that I have a lot of kinship with that way of understanding and thinking about religion. I also have very much a kinship with the kind of interpretive framework, right? Like, again, how do we make meaning out of where we are in our lives or where we are as a society? But at the end of the day, I'm someone who's very invested in understanding the reproduction of inequalities and power. Yeah. So I certainly have a lot of that conflict theorist in me. And so that's where, it might look like it's a book just about small talk and avoidance and silence, but ultimately I'm interested in questions about how that religion affects the society, how religious groups and people affect the society in which they are living, and also what's going on around them that's shaping their attitudes and their positions, whether those be on social or political matters, whether that be about gender, about race, about racial justice, about queer rights,
Yes.
etc. So when I'm teaching sociology of religion to my students, I get them to create a religion. That's what I've been doing since the pandemic. So this past semester, they created soulism, which was sun worship, as connected to wellness culture.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like you got to take care of yourself and eat well and exercise and move constantly. Like right now we're sitting too long, so we should be moving, because if we don't, then our connection with the sun starts to deplete. And then we don't take care of the sun, which is our ultimate source of energy. Anyway, so this is what they came up with. But they had to, have like a set of ideas, a set of expectations of those things that everyone should be doing to keep their religion going. They had a supernatural belief, in this case, the sun, right, about their connection to the sun. But also the reason why I have them do that is we have this part of the project where they have to think about, why would that religion be particularly attractive right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like what's going on in the wider society that's shaping these religious attitudes and beliefs and values?
Yeah.
Like what else? Because religion doesn't happen in a vacuum. We always need to understand it within its larger global and societal context. And so I think from that perspective, I heard Nancy Ammerman once say, sociologists once call it like an ecological perspective on religion or frame. And I think that's very helpful to think about religion in that regard. And I try to get my students and myself, like push myself to always be thinking about religion as something that's a dynamic in interaction with other cultural and social forms.
Yes. Oh, that's
is that answering your question?
It absolutely is.
Like I went off.
No, it is, and then some. Because like it's so good, because I do very much view religion pretty much as politics. It's a social technology. But I love the idea of recognizing that religion doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think for me, prior to my leaving the faith, it did exist in a vacuum. It was just like one day there was no religion, and then God said, "Here it is, y'all." And then sociology kind of allowed me to see, oh no, this thing developed over time. You can go far back as totemism, or animism, and start seeing the social utility in why people would do these things. I've often even said, just on a more deconstructionist perspective, that one of the things I had to give myself permission to realize is like, hey, it's okay to let go of the misunderstandings of the past. At some point, this was an honest pursuit. Things happened later that made it not so honest, but at one point, these were humans trying to answer questions with the best resources that they had at the time. And it wasn't even just trying to answer questions for the sake of answering questions. It was trying to answer questions for the sake of survival. How do we survive in this hostile territory? How do we, in this hostile terrain, how do we survive our differences? How do we survive our ignorances? And religion became a very powerful social tool for allowing people to create coherence where there was none. Especially in a place where coherence wasn't accessible yet. We just hadn't sociologically evolved enough to be able to answer certain questions. And so it helped us build a lot of things. And so I do appreciate that. I see that Bob dropped the question in the chat. And since Bob is the one that made this happen, it's Bob, man. Bob's the guy. He says, is there value in having diverse social circles? Plural is important, so that you have a place to talk about topics in one place that might be taboo in other places. Thank you so much for that question, Bob. I like that. I'm going straight to you, Dr. Amy. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And a funny thing, and based on Bob's new role as leader of children and families, it's interesting because I have a small child, and I was talking with someone about the importance of having different friendship groups or like different kinds of social settings. It's not about like just cultivating of the self and so much how to be successful one day. It's just like emotional well-being, like psychological well-being, is that there's different social circles, and it's not just one. Because again, you're exposed to different ideas. So it's not only about you being able to talk about topics that might be like considered taboo or out of the ordinary in one place, but it's also that you're exposed to different ideas and topics. I think that's just the thing, is like, how can we enrich that for ourselves more, right? Like, we're not just kind of settled into particular echo chambers, all of us, in that regard. So I respect a lot the work that you're doing, Darante, and that you're bringing people on board to have these more elaborate conversations that may or may not agree, right? So that you're not just kind of like on this one side, as you said, sameness, secular camp, and like we're just defining ourselves against something else.
Yes.
But yeah, Bob, I think the answer would be yes. I'd like to know what Bob thinks. What do you think, Darante? What do you have to add to that?
I would say I 100% agree. Hearing your response made me think of like, you need to be in rooms sometimes where you're not the normal one. I think we get so used to viewing ourselves as the norm, as the prototype of how everyone else should be. And I think being exposed to different, and not even just being exposed, but like you said, exposing ourselves to other groups, and having that feeling like, oh, what I thought was just right for everybody is really not. So one thing that I've been exposed to most recently, we just got out of we do our Sunday session series. People call us an atheist church. We are not, but we do our Sunday session series, and we do have small groups as well. But we do our Sunday session series.
So what would you call your atheist church? Got to come up with a name for that.
I just call us a community. We are an innovative community ecosystem, and that's really my biggest desire. My work more so than creating content that changes people's minds. That's really not my goal. My goal is to create spaces and create resources that help people change their own minds. And I feel the best way to do that is to build social infrastructure. And because I think that's one of the things that people lose when they leave this ready-made world that's been provided by their previous religious affiliations. They lose that infrastructure of how to do conversation with other people. And so we've been working on creating that. And so we meet regularly on Sundays. It's online and it's like at noon, but we do these series. And so we're in a series now called NSFW, Not Safe for Work. And it's basically the sex talk. And so we're kind of promoting this conversation within our community. Actually, we just finished it. And I didn't realize, up until the past year or so, how much of a prude I was. I didn't think I was a prude. I thought I was just like, I'm a normal guy. And then I'm learning words that I've never learned before. I think 2 phrases that I was introduced to this year that I was like, what? One was ethical non-monogamy, and the other one was compersion. And we actually got to talk about this a little bit on our live stream this past Sunday. And that was a moment for me, like, I get to be the weird guy in the room. I get to be the guy, the person who's not normal for a moment. I get to be the guy who says, oh, you don't know about that. Other people get to say, you don't know about this. This isn't something you do. And just to actually feel what that feels like, and to find a way to be able to hear and learn. And I love those experiences. I love those experiences where I'm not a replica of everybody else in the room. Again, the thing that I try to resist is just that march towards sameness, because I realize how much I've been sheltered in it. So yeah, I do believe there's value in having diverse social circles. And I love the emphasis on plurals, because it's not just one topic. There's so many various topics. I'm going to say one more thing and then I'm going to shut up because I can talk. We did a series last year called How to Human. And I had to, there was one moment we got into it and I had to sit in something like, I think we take for granted that we think we just know how to human. We think we know how everybody should human. And I gave a small example when you say something like, someone may say something like, oh, I don't like hugs. And many times we go to, something must be wrong with you. Something bad must have happened in your life because you don't like hugs. All humans like hugs. Not only do all humans like hugs, all humans need hugs. And I was cautioning our community to be very careful about treating, humans like this ultimate monolithic group and being mindful of people's individual preferences without assigning a history to it, especially a history you don't know. But we'll do it. And that's kind of what taboos do. But the taboos are not always the wild and kinky things. Sometimes it's the small things, such as not wanting to be hugged when you walk into a building. But it's so interesting to me. And I had to highlight that. Bob, thank you so much for that question. Let me scroll up so I can take them off. Thank you, Bob. Oh,
yeah,
man.
Thanks, Bob. Bob's group at MSU, by the way, the group of students there are just, they're so great. They were so, sorry, I'm going to take this.
Oh, you're fine.
Down a little bit. It was like blind. They're just really great. And they said that one person said that she comes to the group. She'd already graduated at MSU, but she keeps coming back. It's like a space for her to be able to, learn about stuff she hadn't thought about before, be in community with people on this journey of learning and conversation. And I just was so, I guess, enamored by them. I really enjoyed my visit there. So I very, very much appreciate it to Bob. But yeah, I thought that comment you made about how do we get to, what am I trying to say? When you said that about being the person in the room that doesn't know what's going on, or you're not familiar with the language, it's like, how can we cultivate that more for ourselves? Mm-hmm. Because I think a lot of times there is a inclination to just want to stay in one's comfort zone and always seem like you know what's going on, like you know the answer. And it sounds like you found a way to take more joy in that. And I have wondered, how do we get more people to take joy in that?
Yes. Man, for me, it was two realizations, and it's a realization and a metaphor. The realization is I'm intelligent, I'm not omniscient. And it's really easy to conflate those things. It's really easy to think like, I'm really smart, so I know everything that's going on. But there's a metaphor that people used to use called the blind man touching the elephant. And my first time hearing that, I was like, I think that's the most accurate way I can describe my reality, is that I am a blind person touching an elephant with other blind people also touching the elephant on other sides. And the only way I will ever get an accurate depiction of this reality that we're sharing together is to actually expose myself to what the other blind people touching this elephant are. Because if I don't, then I could be touching a part that feels like a wall and conclude that we're all touching a wall. And then someone else can be touching something that feels like a trunk and say, oh, this must be some large piece of rope. I don't know why I said rope, but we'll go with it. And, and that creates conflict, because if I'm living like my intelligence is omniscience, which I already know is limited, then I'm assuming you're just wrong. You're lying. You're misinformed, instead of recognizing that I don't have enough insight. There might be a way for me to get some insight on their side, but I don't have it yet. And so it allows me to take other people's experience with grace, and also just like not having the pressure to say, if you receive what they're saying, I no longer believe I'm going to be contaminated by it, if you will. And that was my religious baggage, is like, oh, if you listen to the wrong thing, you hear the wrong advice, it's going to contaminate me. But now it's just more like, no, it's just their experience. I can take it. I can leave it. I can evaluate it. I can determine where I stand on it. But if I don't even ask for it, I'll never have access to that information. And I'm kind of a data junkie now. I want all of the information that I can get,
I understand. Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
I'm thinking about Don Moon and sociologist Don Moon, a philosopher named Teresa Tobin co-authored a book called Choosing Love. And I'm going to mess up the next part of the title, but it's something along the lines like what LGBTQ plus Christians can teach us all about love and justice, something along those lines. But they write quite a bit about us being relational creatures, and that we are already grounded in wanting to relate to one another, and that we're doing a lot of work oftentimes to not, as you said, get to know what other people, how they see the world. Actually, it takes effort. That's what I'm trying to show in the book, is that it takes a lot of effort to not get to know one another too. You could say that it's just easy and it's about comfort, but it's also, there's a lot of management of what you say, what you feel, what you can express, how you feel, that goes into that. And one of the pieces that I really enjoyed from their book is they talk about humility. Yeah. And I feel like that's what you were getting at, is just like seeing that you don't know everything, and that actually we can all maybe get along a little bit better if we could all realize that. Just come into our interactions or conversations or relationships with people knowing that we don't know everything.
Yes.
And being able to say that we were wrong.
Yep.
When we were wrong.
Yep.
And that's going to be okay. And that actually we can grow from that. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And just your comment made me think about that.
I love it because it and I'll move on in just a second, but I have a real world example of, and it's a funny one. My wife and I watch reality television, and we were watching one, and I was just complaining about, one of the characters' wife, and about how much I didn't like her for him and how he should not be married to her. And I'm just going off every time we watch this show. I'm just really going into it. And then one day while watching, I just have this moment where I'm thinking, like, why am I so invested in this? I don't know these people. All of these really strong, passionate claims I'm making about what he should have done and why she isn't good for him, I don't actually have enough insight to come to those conclusions, nor do I have any type of incentive for me to be that invested. And yet here I am. But that was one of those moments of realizing you're actually robbing yourself here, and also projecting yourself in other people's lives in a very unhealthy way, which social media and media in general has made that so much easier. But now it's what I call being mindful of the proximity gap now, which is, it's very difficult, but I think it saved me from jumping on a lot of bandwagons. It saved me from jumping on, like, when someone comes out and says something happened here, in Nigeria. There was a celebrity who came out a few months ago who was talking about things happening in Nigeria and how badly Christians were being persecuted, and we needed to do something about it. And just like I did when I was watching that reality television show, I paused for a moment. I was like, wait a minute. This person is ultimately in entertainment, and not saying people in entertainment can't be informed. But this person is in entertainment. Their main job is to entertain. They've expressed no passion for journalism. They've expressed no passion for politics whatsoever. And they live over here. For me, it's like a chasm of a proximity gap where you're just not close enough to the information to be a reliable conduit of the information. For me, you might be right, but you're going to have to point me to something to some data source that's actually a little closer to the point of origin or the point of activity. And so it is a little bit, it is definitely that humility aspect. And it's just like, after believing some crazy things for a very long time and realizing that a part of the reason I did so is because I felt like I had to borrow other people's certainty, got me to the place today where I'm really reluctant to depend on anybody else's certainty. I'd love to hear what people have to say. I'd love to hear their ideas. But when we're making claims of truth and what's happening and of reality, I'd like to be able to look at the sources that led you to that conclusion and see if I get to that conclusion myself, instead of just, leaning on you. Mm-hmm. Which and I think this is a perfect segue to the next question, because Welcome is seems to be an evangelical church, but that seems to be a tricky word for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So when people hear the word evangelical, they often think of belief, voting patterns, or public leaders. But your book looks at evangelicalism as a lived social environment.
Yeah.
What does that perspective kind of reveal? Evangelicalism as a belief versus a lived social environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful question, because at the end, it's funny, I didn't talk to people a lot about what they believe. You know, I heard people talk about scripture or their belief in, you know, in Jesus and what Jesus wants for their lives and others, but I don't, it's funny, even in the apologetics group, there wasn't so much talk about belief. And in as sociologists, we can't get into people's heads and know whether or not what they say they believe is what they really believe. So that I find that belief is important. It's an important thing to understand and investigate, but it's pretty limited at the same time. And so we really have to get to practices. What do people do when they're together? And what do those practices, how do they shape what goes on in that community, what people feel is right or wrong, what are the limits of who belongs and who's out, and what are the ramifications for those outside of that particular religious community. So evangelicalism becomes an important way to understand that or study that, especially in the U.S. context, because Protestant evangelicalism is still the most dominant religious form in terms of people participating in it, but also in terms of its political power and its ability to make legislative changes in our democracy. But for instance, the people that I studied didn't even necessarily call themselves evangelical. Some of them had heard the term. Others said that they didn't even know what I was talking about, which I was like, really? You've never heard the word?
Yes.
So I found that surprising. I was like, wow, this is how that, social scientists do this all the time. There's kind of these criteria that historians and social scientists use. Communities that commit to a born again belief, right? The idea that Jesus died on the cross, that you have to personally accept Jesus into your heart as your personal savior. That's one condition to fall under the umbrella of evangelicalism for social scientists. Other things are the affiliation with a religious right, or Republican parties or denominations that have supported the religious right and the Republican Party in the past. So Southern Baptists, being the Southern Baptist Convention, being very top on that list, if not the top. So this church, by those criteria, meet that definition. And another way they met that definition is through the idea that you can read scripture and take it literally. Now, Randall Ballmer and Nancy Ammerman call that selective literalism, and there have been others who call it that the literalism is like selected by the scripture, by what scripture fits what you want to say or what you want to elaborate on, and then you leave other parts of the scripture out. And that evangelical, again, as an umbrella term, tend to draw on the selective literalism. So that's the idea that the word is, that there is a word, capital W, word of God, that one can abide by. And that God, it was written by God through other people, right? So that the Bible that you're reading is the word of God. And that was very much stressed in the church that I studied. So I do call the church evangelical, because that's, again, coherent with the sociological and historical definition, even though maybe the church, including the pastor themselves, might not necessarily be friendly. They're not necessarily friendly to the term.
That's right.
They call themselves believers. So I also do that a lot in the book, because I want to respect how that they see it. They see it as, we're believers. We're not just Christians. We are believers. And so when I was asked whether or not I'm Christian, it was usually, are you a believer?
Are you a believer? Oh my goodness. I remember that language very well. It's very interesting, because looking back, I would be classified as an evangelical. If you would have asked me at any time while I was pastoring, is your church evangelical? Do you consider yourself evangelical? I wouldn't have even known what the word mean. I was like, do you mean, do we evangelize? We evangelize, Or I think that's probably the furthest that my mind would have went. But once I was exposed to the terminology, which of course, my first exposure was more so of a political definition. And it's basically like, hey, evangelicals are the churches that support conservative values. They're the ones that are anti-abortion and anti-gay marriage. And I was like, oh, well, I definitely wasn't that. But then the more look at the definition, it's like, oh, it seems more like what we called, I think, in the early 2000s, fundamental Christianity. Like, oh, you're a fundamentalist. And that's why that selective literalism really resonates with me, because that's really what it was. And even in the language that the pastor of Welcome kind of uses when it comes to patriarchy, which is why it doesn't feel like patriarchy, it's because it's kind of pulling from this selective lyricism, that big W, the word of God. God has given us a way that marriage is supposed to function, that life is supposed to flow. And I, of course, at the time, I didn't realize how much of that was impacting what was acceptable for me to say from the platform, or what was, and it's not acceptable for me to acceptable for me to say. It's just the surface. It's really what's acceptable for me to believe, and that's really what that what that selective literalism kind of does for those who are not doing the selection. This is what is acceptable for me to believe. This is what's acceptable for me to proclaim publicly. Now, you mentioned that the pastor did not feel like, kind of like I didn't feel like he was evangelical. Do you know what his pushback to the term was?
Yeah, he shared that with me one time. He had said that, evangelical, in so many words, he was suggesting that it's synonymous with being racist. And I think that's why maybe you're right in your own understanding of, like, I don't know how much the evangelical applies to me, because I do think for historians and social scientists and journalism, when the term evangelical is used, it is usually referring to white evangelical Protestants.
Yes.
And it does have a political bend to the term, and it has been used that way. So I think that's a fair kind of questioning of, like, does this apply to me? I mean, there's some ways in which the selective literalism is there, but I don't know. He's, again, the church that he and his wife started is trying to not be seen as a space that's racist. Yeah. And so maybe that term evangelical wasn't necessarily the term that he would want to proclaim for himself. But I had also heard in other contexts where he and others called themselves evangelical. So they understood, like, that there's the relationship there, but again, emphasized that we're believers. And the question you asked that I think is a really important one is, like, what's the difference between studying evangelicalism, or any religion for that matter, as a belief versus something that's lived and carried out? Like, what does it mean to believe in the word?
Yeah.
How do people live it?
Yeah.
Right. Yes. And I don't know if this will be helpful, but I'm going to go with this story. So Darlene is someone I call Darlene. I talk about her in the book as one of the people who didn't stick to small talk. She told me I had a potluck one night, in kind of a side conversation. There was women in the potluck. It was a women's potluck, and they were all talking about their husbands and bragging about what they do, or my son's joining the military. And there was this kind of conversation transpiring. And I noticed Darlene didn't have anything to add. She didn't say anything about her son or about her children. I wondered, maybe she doesn't have children. And then she shifts to me and she asked me, are you a theologian? Is that what because she knew I was there for research. I was like, no, I'm not an expert in the Bible. I just said it like that. Like, I'm not an expert in the Bible. Oh, okay. And I said, I'm a sociologist. And then I tried to, like, briefly describe what that is. We ask, how do people build religious communities? How do they come to shared ideas about the world and shared beliefs? And I'm interested in what this church, how it wants to shape its community. Okay. And then she kind of got an okay vibe with me to then tell me that her son isn't married and that he's in his mid-20s, and she's not sure if he'll ever get married. And I wasn't sure where the conversation was going. So I was like, okay, well, I bet he'll be just fine. And I don't have any wedding bands on. Right. So I don't know. I don't know if I also look safe because of my age and that.
Wow.
Like, what is being read about? Like, she's telling me this on the
Yes.
side. Like, I don't know. I'm just kind of guessing some of these things could be. I'm not an expert in the Bible. I don't have on a wedding band, and I'm an outsider. And then a little bit later, I mean, when I say a little bit, I want to say like a minute or two later, she tells me that her son doesn't like Trump. So she brings him up. She's the first person ever brought him
Wow.
up without me asking. And that her husband loves him. And she's like, and when my son comes home to visit, I'm just in the middle. And her eyes started to twitch, and she
Oh my.
she didn't know kind of what to say. And I was wondering what, and I said, I think that happens with a lot of families. You know, people are just avoiding him like the plague, especially if there's tension and conflict there. I'm sorry that you're feeling really stuck in the middle. And then just, it felt like out of nowhere, she's like, my son is gay. And then she starts to tell me about how that she knows her son's born again and he believes in Jesus, and he hasn't found a church home, and he doesn't live in this town. He lives in another state, and he just hasn't been able to find a place. And I said, well, do you think that he could come to welcome to this church, you know, whenever he's here? Like, what do you think? Would this church accept your son? She said, no, no, she didn't say anything. I remember she shook her head no, like, I said, well, you know, the Pastor Bert, he's never said anything. I've actually wondered about that myself, like what his stance is. What makes you think that? And she said, well, they go by the word. And then it was like we were getting called to do, like, everyone, there was an announcement for us to move and do something else. And so she just said it twice. And I found that so fascinating, because that to me is what it means to live it. Is it like the going by the word was not only that there's an implicit understanding that her son would not be welcomed at the church, not in any full affirmative way. Yeah. But also that we don't need to talk about it because we just agree that it's in the word, even though we don't ever say it out loud. And I think that part of it being lived was interesting, because it's like this moment where that it kind of, that short conversation that probably lasted no more than 10 minutes, if that, to me was so revealing. Like when I started the book, I started with that story. Like I wrote with that story for so long because I felt like that was the way in which people are living out the practice of evangelicalism. Yeah. Like so much of it can be, I would argue, is kind of lopping off the tough conversations about how do you square your actual lives with this thing that you're trying to abide by, that you're calling the word, that you're not maybe talking through what that word is. Yeah. Is that helpful? That is. I think there's so many ways we could talk about lived religion, but I wanted to give it in the context of silence.
Well, you know, that it just, do you have any thoughts? Did you land on any thoughts as to why she felt not just safe to share that with you, but what do you think she was hoping to get out of that conversation?
Yeah. I think she was hoping to get a place of someone to hear her. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's what she wanted.
Oh, that's so simple.
Someone listen.
Yep.
I don't think she was. I think at first I thought, where's this going? I'm not sure if what she's about to ask me. Almost like, are you about to set me up with your son? You know, like right, I didn't know. Yes. I was younger then. So, you know, looked like I was on the market or whatever. But no, that was not what was happening. And I think she just wanted a space to listen. And I gathered that in other conversations I had with her. And again, always side conversations at like small group meetings that you're like, oh, someone could overhear this. But this is all happening with just me.
You know, like, I don't want to make it funny, but it reminds me of a famous hostage meme that people use. It's kind of like blink twice if you need help. And that's almost what that just kind of feels like. It's like it almost feels like I know that where I am isn't allowing me to be the person that I actually am.
Yeah.
And this looks like somebody that I can vent that to. I don't have any power to change it yet. And I don't mean that they don't have the power to change it. I mean, they don't see themselves as having the power, because in their mind, that fight is framed as them going against God, not them finding a way to support their family member.
Yeah.
And so it feels so much like that like maybe you felt like a breath of fresh air for her. And it was just, you know, even if I can't change it right now, I can at least give voice to it. And giving voice to that, and I think that's the power of this idea of silence in the whole first place. It felt like that was her pushback against the silence a little bit, to say, finally, I have someone that I can say things to. For me, thinking of family structures was very important to me, especially coming from a Black community in the South, where family is important for, and forgive me for getting political for a moment, it's important for political reasons, especially for a disenfranchised community. It's the first nucleus of economic support. And if that nucleus of economic support is so fragile that it can be torn apart over sexual identity, torn apart over the type of music you listen to, torn apart over vices, then of course, over a long period of time, if that's happening in several Black households and Black folk, I think we out-church everybody else in America. That's the funny way of saying it, but I think that's statistically accurate, is that we have a higher rate of religiosity in our communities than others. And that is often reflected, unfortunately, in ways that don't get talked about, which means we are more likely to kick our kids out if they get pregnant before marriage. We are more likely to kick our kids out if they're homosexual. We are more likely to kick our kids out if they don't, not even if they don't believe, but if they believe differently. If we're National Baptist and you decide to be African Methodist Episcopal, in many families that's enough to get you disowned, because we take these things so literally, because they've been a lifeline. And that's always how I've perceived the Black church, that it was our lifeline. But then I began to realize that church doctrine was actually keeping us from preserving our lifelines, because we were fragmenting ourselves over the smallest things. But that's just kind of how that cookie crumbles, if you will. I want to move on to a question about apologetics, because I want to let you go. We're pretty much at time here. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to ask you two more questions. This one I just wanted to hit because I know it'll definitely resonate with my audience a little bit, and your book engaged it so well. You engaged the idea of apologetics culture. What role does apologetics play in evangelical communities, as you've seen?
Okay. Yeah. Great. Thank you. I realize we're about out of time. I want to just say one thing to the points you just raised about religiosity in Black communities. I'm thinking about W. Du Bois, a very important scholar of religion, who talks about religion as a community center. And the way that you describe that is like a space of affirming, like shoring up resources, sharing resources, a space to be able to let loose without the white gaze. Is very important. Yes. But along with that, what you said about this maybe enhanced shame and stigma, especially around politics of sexuality, are enhanced. Many have suggested are more enhanced in Black communities. I don't know about that, but I'm thinking about Kelly Brown Douglas's book, Sexuality in the Black Church. I would highly recommend that text. She's a theologian. It's a phenomenal book, and how that she talks about white supremacy and the stigmatization of sexuality for Black people, and how that has shaped homophobia, and particularly in the Black church.
Yes.
But apologetics, yes. So the evangelical apologetics group was pretty fascinating. I had a research assistant who was very interested in apologetics, because he was wanting to really study the Bible in an apologetics form. So he was a sociology master student, Pace Ward, and now he's at Notre Dame in the PhD program in sociology there. But great good work, Pace. But he decided that he would do his honors thesis with through my mentorship with something at the church. And I said, okay, they're doing all these small groups. And he saw apologetics on the list and he was like, I think I want to do that. So we went through the whole IRB thing. We made sure that they were okay with the fact that he would be studying this group as for his honors thesis, but that I would also have access to that data, et cetera.
Yeah.
Right. And he was training in ethnography, taking the field notes, but he did a fantastic job. And I draw on his field notes for that section the sections on the apologetics group. But what he found is like there wasn't really a deep dive into the Bible and an understanding of the Bible. Much of what the apologetics group did is they went by, I think it's Gregory Kukul. I think it's Kukul is how you say. What do you know his name?
I
you know who I'm talking about? He wrote a book called Tactics.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So they went by his guide, like a study guide and book. And then he has a video sessions that you can watch on YouTube called, so you look up his name and it's Tactics and it's like how to defend your faith. I know I have the book over there, so I can't remember the exact title, but because I then read the book that they were using. But all of it is so much geared on how to control a conversation with what they call skeptics.
Mm-hmm.
So skeptics are really, I came to understand, is just kind of anything and everything that might not see the world in the way that they do. And this apologetics group, I'd say within the canopy of Welcome Church, was the more combative group. It was fairly small, almost all white men. There were a couple of white women in the group. They met, I think, on a Tuesday night, like after work time. And there were, I would say, think the conversation would get spicy because that's where like professors and diversity inclusion efforts would be named, feminists would be named, and they were all bad, right? Like scientists were bad, and it all felt like skeptics were really just anybody that didn't agree with what they called biblical truth, and that there was a truth, and that truth needed to be the bedrock for our moral understandings in our society. So you could definitely see this group as being some of the people that would advocate for pretty aggressive religious freedom laws. Mm-hmm. Certainly advocating for don't ask, don't tell policy. That was very clear. Like I would say that their politics did come through more clearly in this group than in other groups. But what they spent so much time doing was literally practicing how to control conversations with these, what they called skeptics. And the way that they would do that was they would like watch a little bit of the video and then they'd have a workshop where someone brings up something like, well, I think that partial birth abortion should be legal. Or I think abortion should be illegal after, up until 6 weeks, or in cases of rape and incest. Or I think that there should be same-sex marriage license permitted, et cetera. So these are the kinds of scenarios that they would bring up, and then they would have to practice asking the person who has such a belief different questions that would make them defend why they think that. Yeah. And the whole strategy was, and according to the author of the book Tactics, Gregory Kukul, is to pepper the skeptic with questions that make them explain why they believe what they do, so that you yourself do not have to explain what you believe and why you believe what you believe. And I find that just was so fascinating. I mean, he was on an interview with Focus on the Family where he's talking about that. And there's one point in which him or the interviewer say something like, yeah, I mean, you don't even need to know why you believe what you believe, because that's the idea, is that you are just having the other person defend their views in order to prove them that they're wrong and there's no logic to it. So I think what my grad assistant Pace thought he was going in was going to be about the logic or the reasoning behind his faith. Like he was going to get some answers that were more like grounded in some sort of empirical reality or something, or some logic or philosophical approach. But it really ended up being about that, about how do you, what did they say? It wasn't only we call it the driver's seat, that you're always like in the steering wheel of the conversation. Yep. And I land with that in the book, in a chapter I call Take Down the Red Tape, because it is fascinating that when we talk about the church engaging with what they see as outsiders, a lot of it, again, is about controlling the conversation that you might have with people who don't share your beliefs and worldview.
Yes.
So in a way, they're like practicing it internally all the time, right? Like they got to contain a specific idea within. So there's a lot of work going on within the church amongst one another. And then this apologetics is training one another. And what do you do in a college town when you might rub up against someone who doesn't share what you believe? How do you defend your faith? Well, you make them explain what they believe so you don't have to. And I think that in some ways one of the more surprising things of the research was seeing how that these seemingly different strategies of interacting actually worked together.
Yeah. That was actually my first reaction when I heard that that your assistant wanted to go to the apologetics. I was like, uh-oh, they're in for a surprise. Because like a lot of people think that the apologists are like the most invested into the scholarship. And from my personal experience, nothing could be further from the truth. That's not the apologist arm is so far from the seminary arm of Christianity. The two do not interact, not very often, except for more so in the more doctrinal institutions, which I have a hard time calling them seminaries. But anyway, the apologist, the whole framing is just to shift the burden of proof. But I love the way you said it's not, well, I love the way they presented in tactics to pepper the conversation, to make them defend what they believe, to keep you from having to defend what you believe. And that's just, excuse me, that's just so funny, because that's exactly what it is. It's shifting that burden of proof. I don't have, and it's funny because apologetics, the word means to defend, but they don't actually create a defense for their faith in this sense. They focus on making you insecure in your belief system, which is interesting to me, because I propose that mind change happens on a spectrum of safety. And people change their minds when the new information feels safer than the currently held idea. And that doesn't just have to be safer by virtue of this is better, that this is somehow improved. It could sometimes be safety by what I'm in is not safe for me anymore. And the example that I use, I would never jump out of a building. I consider that very unsafe. So I will never jump out of a building. However, if the building is on fire, that changes my relationship with safety. The building is no longer safe for me, and my safest bet has been to jump out of the building. Nothing about that option has changed at all. It is still as dangerous as it was before. It just now feels safer than what I had before. And I feel like apologists kind of live there. My goal isn't to convince you that jumping out of a building is safe with me. My goal is to convince you that you're in a burning building. And so then I don't ever have to talk about this idea, oh no, this is hard concrete and you're probably going to break a few bones when you hit it, because now all of that's been out of the window because I've changed your condition of safety. And it's so interesting because the ideals we hold are often like our security blankets. And if you can effectively pepper us with that information and mess up that security blanket, mess up our sense of comfort, then you have kind of effectively convinced us that we're in this burning building. And maybe, even though you've not effectively said anything about your actual belief, your option that makes it safer by contrast, you've just made my option no longer a safe place for me to live yet. Which is just, it's a very interesting phenomenon for me to think through. Yeah. Okay. Did you have any thoughts on that?
No, well, yeah, I just like what you said, shift the burden of proof is the phrase that I heard from the apologetics group. And it's I don't think I just said it, so you knew exactly. I was like, oh yes, that's the language. Yes. But that kind of, I think it's also the ways in which people are learning what they're supposed to think and again, not having to wrestle with what they're supposed to think. Because in the
Yes.
end of the day, they focus so much on what this seemingly bad people, the skeptics, think or do, or bar them from practicing their biblical truth, that it closed the door to an opportunity for them to talk about, well, why do those people think that same-sex marriage should be legal? Like, there was
Yes.
never that wrestling with, but why would they think that? I just think
Yeah.
even just that, like, just for the point of even sharpening your own argument, that you would play with that idea. Like, I feel like I do that all the time because I'm studying groups that I'm not part of. So I feel like all the time I'm like, well, why do they think that way? And there was just seemed to be no attempt to do that. And I found that very fascinating because there was so much emphasis on the so-called skeptic without any emphasis on what they actually, like, why they might have that belief. It's more of like, just ask them about it rather than even talking about why they might have it. And I found that in and of itself interesting, because that again helps the group, the apologists, not have to talk about it amongst themselves, because they might not be as on board, right? Again, that biblical sameness concept is like, that's a real performance of biblical sameness. You have an imaginary argument with someone who's not even there when they were sent off to do the homework. A lot of weeks they'd come back and say they didn't practice it on anybody, right? But they were practicing it together in the room. And so much of it is like the performance of like, we are all on the same page. Look, remember, we're not the skeptics. The skeptics are those people. And that to me was just like it was like the sharpened, heightened, extreme case of what I was seeing going on in the larger church. And that I think is happening in many church communities.
Wow. I don't know why, but the imagery it gave me, it was the He-Man Woman Sadist clubs. But you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, this work, I think what you were getting at was that shifting the burden of proof. I feel like that's a lot of the strategy of figures like Charlie Kirk, or this kind of that you have these, what do they call it? The civilized conversation, or I feel like there's been all this promotion of like the civilized discourse, that you're having these tough conversations, and people like Charlie Kirk were going to campuses and having these hard conversations with people, but it doesn't feel like a conversation. It was always, again, it felt like a strategy very similar to the group I studied. It was like, let me ask the questions. I'm framing what the conversation will be.
Yep.
And it's not for us to be changed and transformed by one another. It's that someone needs to win. And I think when everything is about someone winning, that's very dangerous. That's where I will say that's dangerous. I started to feel like I get my sociology hat goes, that is not good for our society. It's scary to me.
Oh my God, you're absolutely right. It's definitely that framing the narrative, controlling the narrative, and pushing the sameness, and winning through dominance, and that concerns me on all sides. I am. I've even had to pull away from certain groups because of just seeing that myself, where the whole goal is just to win over someone else. So like I made a decision that I would not participate in internet debates anymore. Like because I didn't feel that we were seriously trying to get a better understanding of each other. The goal just kind of becomes to dunk on each other and who can win. And I have to think about, like, I don't have to, but I do. I think about far-reaching impacts. Like, what's the win here? Like, what other than embarrassing somebody, other than making somebody else look like they don't know what they're talking about, what actually happens in the real world of people who are engaging this as an audience? How does it impact them? And for me, it got a little concerning. I was like, I don't feel like I'm actually doing scholarship. I feel like I'm doing entertainment at this moment. I feel like I'm doing theater. And my concern there is that then theater becomes substitute for education. Theater becomes substitute for scholarship. And I don't want to do that because then that just lends more credence to more pseudo intellectual authority figures. So whoever sounds like the most confident person in the room gets to win the argument. And that's not how we determine, the validity of an argument. And so I have had my concerns about that for a while. So that feels good. that someone who's done so much more than me in sociology also has similar concerns. That makes me feel validated a little bit, you know. My last question for you for tonight is, after readers finish Whispers in the Pews, what do you hope they're able to notice, maybe able to name or question that they may not have seen before or even considered before?
For those involved in evangelical church cultures more broadly, is that who you're referring to, or for?
Yeah, let's do that. I wasn't, but I like that
Who
framing.
are you referring to? I'm
That
curious.
probably, I was just referring to everybody, but that framing is a little more specific, so I like it.
Well, I mean, I would say that maybe for all of us, it is that what I think what we've been touching on throughout this conversation, Darante, which is it's not always the healthiest option to avoid conversations that are hard.
Mhm.
And that I think in particular for white people in this society
Yes.
that have lots of advantages, it's easy to stay in a more comfortable place, in a place to where that you're not made to feel uneasy or wrong and held accountable for one's actions and behaviors. Because that's true that once you start opening up space for those difficult conversations and have to contemplate how you relate to others in your community and outside of your community, there might be actions and changes that have to take place. And so I think that there is, there are risks involved in that regard. Like there's potential investment, but you also can change and be transformed by it in really powerful and wonderful ways. So it's definitely not bad, right? Like it's good stuff to do that. But I think one of the main things to take away from is to pay attention to when one might be relying in their communities on just assuming that you're all on the same page, whether that's a secular community or a religious one, or one that's kind of somewhere in between. Is think about what does it mean to be secular? What does it mean to say that one isn't religious? Like, how is one defining that for themselves? And is that a shared definition for others? Just having space to talk through those kinds of questions is really important. And if there is a presumed position, maybe name it and say, hey, what do you think some of our assumed positions are? I think that these are kind of the lessons that we can learn from this, is for us to just be okay with naming what we assume others think and be able to talk about those assumptions. I think maybe I'm talking about lessons, and I don't know why, because sociologists are not good at giving advice at all.
Number one, I feel like that's such a cool experiment to do, is to get a group of affiliated people in a room and say, what do we assume that we all agree on? Because I'll be honest, I remember having a moment that made me very discomfortable. I was participating with an organization, and we only know each other through our social media content. And so I was participating in a conversation, and its conversation is being streamed out live. And someone used the phrasing, well, we all think, referencing to everybody who was on the panel, well, we all think this. And I was like, whoa, we've never had that conversation. How do we get to make that jump to what we all think? But I think it's actually quite common that we make these assumptions about, or presumptions about, what everybody, and kind of going back to that small, silly example I gave earlier, everybody wants a hug. That's one of those small presumptions that we have. No, everybody in this room wants the same thing, thinks the same things. We all agree this. But I think actually platforming that as an intentional conversation is such an incredible social experiment, to say, okay, let's just sit in a room, 10 to 12 of us. We're all good friends. We're all well affiliated. And let's see what our shared assumptions are. And I'd love to chat, like every week, pick somebody to pick 3 shared assumptions that you think we have. And let's talk about it and see if we really do. Maybe we do share the assumption that abortion is always okay. Let's see if we all share it. And I think that will probably lead to some uncomfortable conversations, but that's the point, is to kind of sit with that discomfort. I think humans have a really hard time sitting with discomfort, but we need to exercise that muscle more. We need opportunities to exercise that muscle more. And I think one of the things your book does a great job at is demonstrating how we're often robbing ourselves of that. And again, to pull on an old cultural saying, because we're so busy trying to go along to get along. But I think if we're ever going to get better, then we're going to have to get those muscles stronger and getting used to being uncomfortable. Oh my goodness.
That's so good. I think that should be the end right there. No, really, I really liked how you put that.
Thank you.
Just sitting with the discomfort and being able to say what you supposedly all think about, you all agree on, and naming what that is, and then seeing where that there might be some disagreement, and knowing that, giving each other the benefit of the doubt that because you're willing to participate, it's actually that you care even more for one another.
Yes.
Because you really want to know one another. And I think that sometimes we kind of think that differences between each other is something that's going to build a wall between us, rather than build something that's a more deeper connection. And I hope that I can learn that for myself from doing this research. I'm hoping I can contain that for myself, like keep it with me.
Oh my.
Yeah.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I cannot express my gratitude for you being here with us tonight. As you know, I had so many more questions, but this was perfect. I want to put you on the spot, so I won't, but I'm still going to say it. I would love to get you back on for another conversation. I think there's so many things to talk about. Oh my goodness. Like, I do want to know more about the Mississippi Queer Histories Project. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, the Queer Mississippi Histories Project. Yeah, it's a big archive, and all the interviews are available on eGrove through the University of Mississippi audio recordings. It's incredible. People are sharing their stories, and there's a lot there. That's a lot.
That's fascinating to me. Well, I'm gonna let you go for this evening. I'm gonna drop you back on the stage. Thank you so much for being here again. Is there any final thing you'd like to say to our audience before I let you go?
No, I just really enjoyed the conversation. You had such thoughtful comments that were great. It would help me think through. Your questions helped me think through some parts that I might have kind of been on the periphery of my mind, but I hadn't really had to flesh out before. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of those watching. And if you want to rent the book, borrow it, or buy it, this is it. And this is it. Yes. All right.
I love it. Thank you again so much. I'm going to drop you to the back of the stage. And of course, you can feel free if you need to go to leave. I'm going to run an outro after this. But again, thank you for being here. Everyone, y'all, this was amazing. Thank y'all for showing up to this. I hope you got something out of this. Like, again, to me, I kind of felt like a student again back in my college days, being able to sit with my professor. For those of you who read my book, you know, one of the people who had such an influence on my life was Dr. Geneve Brooks. And she was my professor of sociology, social science, urban development when I was going through my undergrad. And just introducing me to all of these concepts. She was actually the first person to introduce me to Emil Durkheim's work, and it changed my mind forever. I want to point out something that Dr. McDowell said tonight that I think we should all take very seriously. That, you know, we live in a country right now that sociology is under attack. And after this conversation and after the work that you see I do, I hope you know why. I hope you understand why sociology is such a threat. Because, man, it's one of the most beautiful sciences that we have, because it gives us insight into who we are as a lived species, not just our anthropology, not just our history, but our lived experience. It is our shared story. It is a tool that we can use to better understand each other without making the assumptions, right? And so I say that to say, hey, support sociology, please. Find a sociology professor somewhere and hug them. Support sociology, support the social sciences. Again, thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. In an hour from now, for those of you who are part of our Bridge City community, we're having a Deconstruction Club event. I'm going to be hosting it, which means I only have a little bit of time to get a break and get some rest. but I'd love to see you there if you're available. It's going to be a really great time. But other than that, man, I love you all. Until next time, keep rising.
Don't sit around, please don't settle now. We can do better now. We can get up. Please don't sit around, please don't settle now. We can do better now.